I'd like to welcome everyone to this very timely event on the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. This event is co-hosted by the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide, the Australian Services Roundtable, the European Services Forum, and the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, and we're very grateful to them for co-hosting today. I am Stuart Harbinson, your moderator for today's proceedings. For the last few years, I've been advising the Hong Kong Coalition of Services Industries on Geneva and WTO activities of interest to them. The Hong Kong CSI is in fact quite a venerable institution in the services field, having been founded in 1990 as a policy think tank for the Hong Kong General Chamber of Commerce. Services currently account for about 3/4 of GDP in developed economies, and many developing economies are increasingly services-based, sometimes with more rapid growth rates. In Hong Kong, actually, services account for as much as 92% of GDP. Services value added accounts for almost half of all world trade now, goods and services combined. However, the costs of trading services have been estimated to be about twice as high as the trade costs for goods. The WTO is mandated under the General Agreement for Trade in Services to negotiate improved disciplines on services domestic regulation. As we know, on the business side, regulatory measures and red tape can sometimes be unnecessarily burdensome, and in some cases effectively constitute barriers to trade in services. They're also very costly to business. Over a number of years, quite a lot of progress was made under this original WTO negotiating mandate. However, as we all know, it's hard to reach consensus amongst all 164 WTO members. And as a result, around 60 of those members eventually decided to try to reach agreement amongst a slightly smaller group. But in doing so, they said that they would build on all of the previous work that had been done, and they would try to take on board as many as possible of the points of view that had been expressed. The proponents of this initiative also remained committed to producing a multilateral result. We're here today to hear how much progress they've made, which is a lot, in fact. In December 2020, a draft reference paper, largely agreed but with a few outstanding points, was circulated as a basis on which the members concerned could commit to increased disciplines. In addition, today, we'd like to hear more about the road ahead and get some views on what this might mean for services trade, particularly, although not exclusively, in the Asia-Pacific region. We couldn't have a better keynote speaker than Jaime Cogui Arias, who is the coordinator of the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation in Geneva. Jaime's day job is as Deputy Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the WTO, and Costa Rica is an extremely active delegation in many areas, so he is a very busy man. Jaime, thank you so much for sparing the time in what I know is a packed week to be with us today. We've had well over 200 registrations around the world for this event, and you are undoubtedly the star attraction. After Jaime, we'll hear from our discussants. In the interests of timekeeping, I hope they'll forgive me if I don't introduce them in detail, but you can find fuller bios on the Institute for International Trade's website. So very briefly, our discussants are Pascal Kernijs, who is Managing Director of the European Services Forum in Brussels. The ESF is the voice of European services industry in international trade and investment negotiations. Kiyotaka Morita is Deputy Director of the International Affairs Bureau at the Kaidan Ren, and also a visiting professor at the Hitotsubashi University School of International Public Policy. Roy Chun Lee, the Senior Deputy Executive Director of the TWWTO and RTA Center in Chinese Taipei, who specializes in trade liberalization policy and provides expert advice on WTO affairs. Roy also represents the Coalition of Services Industry. Devi Aryani is the Executive Director of the Indonesian Services Dialogue Council, an independent council that focuses on policy and regulatory reforms for the development of services sector in Indonesia. Jason Lee is Director of International Policy and Engagement at the Singapore Business Federation, where he oversees business engagement on cross-border trade and investment issues. Jason also has past experience as a trade negotiator himself. Jane Drake Brockman is Industry Professor at the Institute for International Trade in Adelaide and Jean Monnet Director of Trade and Investment in Services Associates. Jane is the founding member of the Australian Services Roundtable and co-convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition. She's no stranger to Hong Kong either, I might add. Eduardo Pedrosa is Secretary General of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which is a unique tripart policy-oriented partnership between business, government, and academia, for those who are not familiar with it. Eduardo has also written extensively on trade and economic issues. Patrick Chua of the Philippine Services Coalition is also coordinator of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, regarding the formation of which he was a driving force. And last, but far from least, is Marcus Gelito, who is a counselor in the Trade and Services Division at the WTO Secretariat. I should mention in the present context that Marcus is also Secretary to the WTO's Working Party on Domestic Regulation. Let me just add that we'd hoped to have representation from Thailand today on the panel, but this didn't work out in the end. Even so, we have a galaxy of very knowledgeable discussants, and we look forward to hearing from them. Before giving the floor to Jaime, I'll state the obvious, which is that we're up against a tight timetable. We've asked the discussants, therefore, to speak only for about 3 minutes each, in order, hopefully, to allow for some interaction at the end. Our total time window is 90 minutes. Tight as it is, I hope we'll be able to fit in some questions towards the end. And if you want to ask a question, please feel free to use the QA function in Zoom, and we'll try to accommodate that. Finally, please note that the session is being recorded, and all registered guests will receive a copy of the recording in the coming days. So with those words of introduction, I think we should waste no further time and give the floor to Jaime Kogi Arias to give us his keynote address. Jaime, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for these introductory remarks and your introduction. I just want to be sure that you can see the presentation on the screen.
Yes, we can, or at least
okay,
I can,
great.
I think.
Great. So, dear Stuart, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this very interesting and timely webinar. It's a pleasure to be virtually here with you today and to give you an overview of the negotiations in the WTO Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, which I have the honor of coordinating. This initiative has gathered, over the past 3 years of negotiations, an increasing number of WTO members across all regions of the world. And at the moment, it brings together members accounting for 3/4 of world services trade. In the coming 15 minutes, I would like to address these 3 main points. First, I would like to set out the meaning of services domestic regulation and what is covered by this term. Secondly, I would like to explain how the issue of services domestic regulation is addressed within the WTO, and in particular, what current negotiations on the matter in the joint initiative has produced. Finally, I would like to inform you about the current status of the negotiations and provide you with an outlook on what the initiative expects to achieve by the next WTO Ministerial Conference, which will take place in December this year. Let's begin then with what is services domestic regulation. For services business who wants to export abroad, and you know better than me on that, it is sometimes challenging to find out about the requirements for obtaining a license, and often there is no one to turn to for information. When suppliers file their applications, they are at times left in the dark as to how long processing times will be and by when they can expect approval of their application. Sometimes obtaining information about the status of applications or even whether such applications are complete or have been rejected is difficult to come by. In some places, documentation requirements are excessive and burdensome and still relying on paper rather than electronic means, or original documents rather than certified copies. And it's therefore not surprising that services business from both developed and developing countries have voiced their concerns on requirements and procedures that regulate their access to the services markets. As you can see from the highlighted words in these quotes, requests for enhancing transparency, including through stakeholder involvement, and enhancing predictability and certainty of regulatory frameworks have been of primary concern in this regard. In a nutshell, what business have long been demanding are transparent, fit-for-purpose requirements and procedures which minimize the unintended consequences of regulations in services sectors. Now that we have clarified what services domestic regulation means, let me move to the question on how this issue is addressed specifically at the WTO. The WTO Services Agreement, the GATS, focuses primarily on the progressive reduction of quotas and discriminatory barriers to trade, and contains only rudimentary protections for services suppliers against unnecessarily trade restrictive regulatory requirements and procedures. After a long hiatus in the multilateral negotiations at the WTO, a group of WTO members created the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation and have worked hard to develop a set of disciplines on regulatory matters. Building upon GATS regulatory provisions, these disciplines aim to address the practical challenges that affect services business ability to operate by enhancing transparency and predictability of authorization procedures. For the avoidance of doubt, the text developed by the initiative clarifies that the disciplines on domestic regulations do not and cannot in any way diminish any existing obligations of members under the GATS. Rather, they constitute improvements of participating members' existing commitments. The disciplines on services domestic regulation developed by the joint initiative respond broadly to the needs expressed under the following 3 pillars: transparency, legal certainty and predictability, and regulatory qualification and facilitation. On transparency-related matters, members will be required to make available all information needed by business to comply with requirements and procedures for authorization. In addition, members will have to respond to inquiries by services suppliers through appropriate mechanism. And finally, the involvement of suppliers in regulatory design will be improved with a call for publication of draft laws and regulations and establishment of opportunities for suppliers to comment on such proposed measures. Under the pillar of legal predictability and certainty, the discipline's objective is to ensure minimum warranties to be followed by relevant authorities during the licensing and authorization process. As you can see from the screen, this includes several elements such as indicative timeframes for processing applications, information on completeness of applications, information on status and decisions on applications, and the possibility to resubmit applications in case of rejection, as well as reasonable time period between publication of laws and regulations and their entry into force. Finally, the disciplines also aim to improve the regulatory quality of services markets and facilitate trade in services, including by encouraging members to accept electronic applications and authenticate copies of documents, require the independence and impartiality of regulatory authorities, and transparency and reasonability of authorization fees. Moving on, I would also like to highlight that the text developed by the initiative provides for certain built-in flexibilities that aim to preserve space for differences in WTO members' regulatory capacity and approaches. For example, by allowing participants to implement the majority of the obligations to the extent practicable, or encouraging them to take certain actions. In addition, developing countries participating in the negotiations can delay the application of specific provisions in sectors in which they face implementation difficulties. The use of transitional periods can aid them to make any necessary adjustments to their domestic regulatory frameworks. Less developed countries deciding to join the initiative will integrate the disciplines into their GATS commitments only when they graduate from LDC status. At that time, they can designate any necessary transitional periods they require. The regulatory disciplines that the initiative has negotiated over the past 3 years and that I just presented to you are contained in the reference paper on services domestic regulation. Participating members will incorporate the final set of these disciplines into their respective GATS schedules following well-established WTO procedures. The commitments will apply on an MFN basis. In other words, services suppliers from all WTO members will enjoy the benefits of the disciplines when they trade with members who will have adopted the disciplines. Now, we have one last question to address, namely, where do the WTO negotiations on services domestic regulation currently stand? I would like to start by informing you on where the initiative is coming from to move to what the status of work is currently and what the initiative expects to deliver by the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference in December this year. First, on the initiative's origin, at the end of 2017, building upon previous work of at the WTO, ministers from 59 like-minded and actively engaged members issued a first joint ministerial statement in which they affirmed their commitment to the negotiations on services domestic regulation. After 2 years of extensive work, in May 2019, these members committed to continue working towards finalizing negotiations by MC12. At the moment, 63 members are part of the joint initiative. They represent almost 75% of world services trade. As you can see from the map on the screen, there are currently 8 participants from the Asia-Pacific region: Australia, China, Hong Kong, China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, Chinese Taipei, and Thailand. Although some members from the Asian group have showed an interest in the work of the initiative, they have not yet indicated their intention to formally join these negotiations. The initiative is currently working on a close to final version of the negotiating text. Only a few, but very important issues remain to be solved. My own assessment is that these issues may require decision at a higher political level, closer to the day of finalization of the negotiations. And among the participants, 57 WTO members have already circulated their indicative draft schedules, which foreshadow how they intend to incorporate the disciplines in the respective services schedules. These drafts confirm participants' commitment to a legally binding GATS Plus outcome that would apply in addition to their existing obligations on regulatory matters. In the meantime, the initiative is conducting several outreach activities to encourage more WTO members to join the negotiations and enhance the visibility of the initiative outside the WTO. The primary goals of these outreach efforts is to secure a broad reach of the negotiating outcome with a view of benefiting services suppliers across the world. We have reached the last point I would like to address in my presentation. As you can see, the negotiations are substantively at a very advanced stage, and the joint initiative is close to delivering an outcome. Domestic regulation is, as I'm sure most of you will have heard already, one of the most promising prospects for delivery by MC12. Many members are already implementing most of the domestic regulation disciplines in their national regulatory frameworks and have agreed on similar disciplines in regional and bilateral trade agreements. An outcome on services domestic regulation will not break new ground, but will have a concrete impact on the operations for service suppliers and the performance of services sectors. It will contribute to promoting the transparency, predictability, and efficiency of services markets, and for that reason constitute an important building block in the post-COVID economic recovery. I believe, and all the members in this initiative firmly do as well, a result in services domestic regulation will renew energy and trust in the multilateral trading system and the WTO as a negotiating forum. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much indeed, Jaime. That's great. A brilliant start to the session and extremely informative. Could I just ask you if you could briefly say a few words about any of the issues which are still outstanding in the reference paper without going into any detail, but I think it'd be interesting to know that if you've got some information you can share with us. And also maybe if you've got a comment on how the proponents of the initiative are viewing the MFN aspect of this, because I think you said that the intention is that the proponents would put these disciplines in their schedules and apply them on an MFN basis. And that's sometimes with these initiatives, that's quite a difficult point, because it seems like there could be some free riders getting the benefits of this while not making any commitments themselves. So is there a kind of view amongst the members of the initiative on that point? Over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Very briefly, there are four main issues that is still to be solved. One important issue is how whether we have specific disciplines for the financial services sector, which is something of interest of many of the participants, but it's still to be decided. Another issue that is being discussed and need a decision is the length of the transitional periods for developing countries. We have some figures there in the text, so it has to be decided which of the figures we pick up from the different possibilities. It will depend very much on the discussions and the participation of developing countries as well. Another issue is the discipline to avoid discrimination between men and women, which is something that has gathered support from many participants, but is still to be decided. And another broader issue, and which is related as well with your second question regarding the MFN application, is about the broader participation. How we can expand the participation of some other economies in these negotiations. Of course, we are working on the assumption that we will finalize by the MC12, and we will be happy to be joined, and we welcome all WTO members that have not yet decided to join, but the participants are committed to finalize, even with the current number of participants. So, but hopefully we can gather some others in order to provide a broader and to have a broader participation, and to also to have a broader application of these disciplines amongst the WTO members. There is no discussion on any critical mass. This is what I'm trying to say. But of course, this question is an important one, and it's part of what everybody has in mind, and that's why now we are focusing our efforts on these outreach efforts.
Thanks very much, Jaime. I mean, would it be fair to say that the proponents kind of see this as in their own interests, because by adopting these disciplines, they're improving the competitiveness of their own services sectors?
Definitely. I think every single participant is looking at it on its own interest as well, because it improves the investment climate, the investment environment, and also improves the environment and the climate for their own services providers.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Well, we're already getting one or two questions coming in, so I hope, Jaime, you can bear with us, and we'll try to come back to you later on. But in the meantime, I think we need to push on with hearing from our very distinguished discussants, and let me begin with Pascal Canais. So, Pascal, can I turn to you?
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you very much to Jaime. Maybe first thanking Jane and Lydia from the Institute of International Affairs of Adelaide, because without them we wouldn't have been able to organize this event. Thank you very much to Costa Rica to put Jaime at disposal to this very important issue, and also we have now a new Deputy Director General as Annabel Gonzalez joining in, so, and our ambassador is also very active, so thank you very much for that. This issue of services domestic regulation is really important, but it is true, it is not sexy. It is complicated to persuade the politicians on this, but this is absolutely crucial for the services export and the possibility for our companies to establish themselves in other countries. So this is an issue that the European Services Forum has been working from its very beginning 20 years ago, and we have been working on different position papers. We have been working on the work of the Working Party on Domestic Regulation over the years, and Jaime forgot to say that before having the ministers in Buenos Aires pushing for having this statement initiative, they nearly finished to conclude this in Buenos Aires. But due to lack of proper result, we didn't manage to have a result. But that is nearly a mature issue, and I think we have to go ahead. When we ask, and we have developed ourselves a position paper in January 2019 to push it against this new initiative, because when we ask our companies, what are your main difficulties if you want to export and establish yourself in another country, immediately comes lack of transparency of the regulation. Difficulty to find the information. Where do I get my license? What do I need to be authorized for? So these disciplines pushing for publication of all legislation in services sectors, having, if possible, the text in English, having, if possible, one portal, one-stop shop where to find information, having regulatory disciplines pushing for independent regulatory bodies. All of that is absolutely welcome and necessary for us. So we hope that we will have these results. Because I don't have much time, I would like to say what are the next steps for us. We hope that this MC12 will be able to deliver these disciplines. The text is nearly finished, as Jaime said, and that is really good. We would like now to push and sell the issue, and this event is part of it, to make sure that the largest number of countries understand that it is in their own interest to join in. We know it's difficult to sell this issue to the politician, but this is one of the possibility to deliver something in the end. We should not be stopped if we're not able to finalize the text at the end. We should be able, nevertheless, to grab what we have and move ahead. The maximum number of countries would be welcome, and we hope that some ASEAN countries will join in, because as Stuart put to Jaime, this is an issue where MFN is a good thing because there is no free riders possibility here. The winners are going to be those who commit. Those who do not commit will not win anything. They're actually going to be the losers. So transparency is a winning thing, and we hope that many countries will join in. Let me conclude by saying that let's conclude these talks. Let's register these additional commitments that Jaime talked about, with 57 countries already engaged to do that, because that is going to be the first time since the creation of the WTO that we will have a new set of rules for the services sector since 1995. I think this is really key. And it is going to be a demonstration, actually, that at the end, the WTO is still able to deliver into its negotiating function. So let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pascal. You put it much more eloquently than I could. Well done. Could I move on now to Kiyotaka Morita of Keidanren? Morita-san, what do you see as the benefits to regional business from a WTO outcome on services domestic regulation? I know the Japanese business community has long highlighted the trade costs associated with the uncertainty and opaqueness of regulatory regimes for services, and pointed out that the constraints these costs impose on FDI flows and outsourcing activity, especially in the ASEAN region. The COVID-19 health pandemic has caused a very big drop in FDI into the Asian region. So attracting investment flows is a very high priority.
Yeah.
Do you think, Morita-san, that these WTO negotiations on domestic regulation can help?
Well, yes, of course. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Yes, I want to make some comments from the Japanese business point of view. As you have correctly pointed out, Japanese companies are doing business abroad, especially in East Asian countries, and many of the Japanese companies are SMEs. And as you have correctly pointed out, COVID-19 has adversely affected Japan's FDI last year, and we are working hard to restore the situation. And yes, we do think addressing domestic regulation is the key to facilitating FDI. And even if trade in services, trade in services mode 3 is liberalized under GATS Article 16 and 17, it is very difficult for companies to do business unless the domestic regulation of the hosting country is transparent. So I think addressing domestic regulation is very important. And to address this issue, clauses on transparency of domestic regulations are incorporated in many of the FTAs and EPAs to which Japan is a party, and those include TPP and RCEP. And while the transparency clauses in FTAs and EPAs contribute towards reducing entry barriers bilaterally, this WTO discipline on the domestic regulation would contribute to reducing entry barriers multilaterally or plurilaterally, and this is very important. And I understand that the current draft text addresses important issues such as application procedures and dialogue on mutual recognitions, or opportunities to comment before entering into force of a regulatory frame, or the open and transparent procedures when adopting technical standards. And we think those are very important, and therefore it is anticipated that the negotiations to be finalized by the MC12 this year. And as Pascal has correctly pointed out, it is important that many WTO members as possible should commit themselves to this discipline under GATT's Article 18. And also, I think it is very important that this discussion on discipline on services domestic regulation would be reflected in the discussion on the investment facilitation, which is now underway at the WTO. And for instance, I understand that this discipline is legally binding in sectors where specific commitments are undertaken. However, from the viewpoint of facilitating investment as a whole, this discipline should be highly regarded in all sectors, regardless of whether or not the specific commitments are undertaken. And I think this is very important. So I shall stop here now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kiyotaka. That's an excellent point you made at the end there as to the coverage of the disciplines. I'm going to turn in a minute to Dr. Roy-Chun Lee, but we have a question, Jaime, that I thought maybe I could come back to you on if that's okay with you. The question's from Axel Berger, and he says that the DSR negotiations cover many regulatory issues that are also covered in the investment facilitation negotiations. Could you say anything as to the rationale of negotiating similar provisions, along the two different tracks, and how can any overlaps between the domestic regulation negotiations and investment facilitation, and also between those two and the GATS, be limited and contradictions avoided? Quite a difficult question, but is there anything you could say to us on that point?
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, well, that's very briefly. Well, I should say that the investment facilitation initiative has a much broader scope that includes goods trade. It is not limited to services in schedules. Also addresses other issues related to regulatory coherence, like impact assessments of major measures. Including as well supplier databases aimed at matching those suppliers with foreign investors and intergovernmental cooperation. Yes, there is an issue of overlap, but I think I should say that this issue is on the side of transparency and governance and predictability of investment-related administrative procedures. But participants are aware of these overlaps and are trying to match the language between the agreements and are aware that they need the disciplines in both cases need to be compatible. So that's why some of the proposals in the side of the investment facilitation initiative has been inspired or taken from what we already have, let's say, achieved in the DOMREC negotiations. So there is certainly some overlaps, but as I said, the scope is broader in the case of the investment facilitation disciplines. In our case, the disciplines will apply, as correctly said by Morita-san, to the sectors committed in the GATT schedule. In the investment facilitation disciplines will have a broader scope of application, and will include as well goods, and the areas are not exactly the same. So we are talking about two different issues and two different aspects of the economy.
Thanks, Jaime. That's very helpful. So now, turning to Dr. Lee, Thanks so much for joining us today on behalf of the Coalition of Services Industries in Chinese Taipei, Dr. Li. For nearly 2 decades now, I know that you've written highly persuasive pieces on the importance for regional integration of good domestic regulatory practices. So we're keen to hear your perspectives on why the WTO joint initiative on services domestic regulation is of interest to businesses not only in Chinese Taipei, but also in other regional economies. Can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Stuart. You can hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thanks. Thank you very much. And it's my great pleasure to be able to join this webinar on this meaningful discussion, not only meaningful, but timely discussion on the WTO Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation. This joint initiative is a very important progress for the WTO in terms of services liberalization since 1995, because currently the WTO General Agreement on Trading Services, or the GATS, addresses primarily 2 major categories of issues. The first one is market access opening, and the second one is national treatment or removal of discriminatory regulatory measures. And over time, in the last 25 years, we did indeed see a great refinement, especially in the APEC region and in other parts of the world on these 2 areas. So market access has been removed, barriers has been removed, non-discriminatory treatment has been reduced significantly. But on the other hand, there remains a very broad set of non-discriminatory regulatory measures that is still impeding services liberalization. As reflected in the OECD Services Trade Restrictive Index, you can see there's a wide range, a variety of restrictive regulatory measures remain in place. And as reported in the latest update of the STRI report, OECD found that the regulatory environment for services sector has actually become more restrictive since the year 2020, after the COVID-19, especially in terms of, for example, foreign investment screening process. So that indicates that the joint initiative and other efforts are still needed to move forward with a full and a meaningful liberalization of the services sector. Today, I would like to offer actual experience from Taiwan or Chinese Taipei on the value of the disciplines on domestic regulations. Now, many studies demonstrate that the impediment effect of unnecessary regulatory measures took place after market access. But in our experiences, we are actually witnessing the impeding effect that is happening before market entry. Let me take the regulatory transparency regarding services licensing as the example. Now, the lack of transparency in licensing procedure creates uncertainties on both the substantive rules and also the procedure applicable to a licensing to an applicant, right? Also, there will be unpredictability regarding the outcome of the application. Now, we heard actual stories from our service supplier, not really MISME, but a small service provider who is trying to establish a food and beverage outlet in foreign market. The story is that because the uncertainty and the unpredictability creates a room for rent-seeking activities, and this small service supplier actually fall into victim of the rent-seeking activities when they are involved in a licensing application process. So they find a local consultant who promised that they will be able to offer a full package service all the way to get the license on behalf of this service provider. The consultant keep telling this applicant, this small service company, that the local government is actually changing the policy, so they have to accelerate the process. They have to get the license through, powerful friends and through special channels. Now, so they end up actually paying at least 8 to 10 times higher fees than the actual regulatory fees required. And also the whole process was delayed for several months. And the worst part is that this service provider was forced, or not really forced, but pushed to conclude several unnecessary contracts with local partners based on false information provided by this consultant or the rent seekers. So, this creates a kind of vicious circle, right? The rent seekers have all incentive to keep the regulation opaque and uncertain, because that's the foundation of their business model, right? So all the new entrants have high interest to seek for these consultancy services, which in turn provide the resources for those rent seekers to increase their level of influence. So I think the only way and the most effective way to break this vicious circle, to create a real meaningful competition on the ground, is through collective efforts, such as the WTO Joint Initiative on the services domestic regulations. So that is the only way to use this external pressure, the external impetus, to break this vicious circle. So that is, to me, and perhaps to most of the small service provider here in Taiwan, Chinese Taipei, that the most valuable contribution of the WTO JI services domestic regulation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Ye. So that's a great real-world business example of the sort of things that businesses face and of what could be done to help them. Thanks a lot. Great contribution. Let me turn now to Devi Aryani and ask how does the Indonesian Services Dialogue see this issue? ISD advocacy, like many services coalitions, has been very focused on calling for good domestic regulatory practice. And Devi, do you see the WTO process as useful to Indonesian services businesses?
Well, thanks, Stuart. Thanks to Jane as well, who brought me in this discussion. Let me start with putting out the fact that services is the largest sector in Indonesia, with 55% contribution to Indonesian GDP, and the fact that Indonesian businesses comprises of 90% of SMEs. So therefore, this WTO process in services domestic regulation has been very much helpful for the SMEs. Not only it provides a regulatory framework in international trade, but it also potentially reduces trade barriers for cross-border trade, minimize cost of compliance for the SMEs, and it also opens up the opportunity for new businesses. So these are all important factors for the SMEs. Therefore, the consensus on services domestic regulation will be of important value to SMEs, not only in providing them clarity in terms of businesses, as well as enabling the SMEs to participate in international trade. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Devi, for that perspective from Indonesia. And we'll move on now to Jason Lee in Singapore. And Jason, Hong Kong and Singapore are certainly among the world's most open and services-oriented economies. The business communities in both of our economies has often made its position pretty clear that uncertainty and opaqueness of regulatory regimes act as major constraints on trade and investment in services. Our keynote speaker, Jaime Cogui Arias, has explained that the joint initiative on services domestic regulation has the potential to deliver the first multilateral outcome on this issue, actually since the WTO was established. but ASEAN members seem rather reluctant to actively support the WTO negotiations. How does the Singapore business community view this? Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Stuart, for this thought-provoking but difficult to answer question. Thankfully, I'm not having to answer this question as a government officer. So you're very right that above all else, businesses need certainty and predictability in the regulatory, trade, and business environment. This is something that our businesses have consistently told us. It's more important than even cost or trade barriers. If they don't know what they have to comply with or what restrictions they face, it becomes impossible for them to plan or to determine what they want to achieve in the market. So the EU and the US are the top two markets for Singapore services exports. ASEAN as a bloc is third, with Japan and Australia making up the rest of the top five. So from the perspective of Singapore businesses, we would definitely hope to see both US and ASEAN member states joining the agreement from MC12 in December, which is when the expectation is that this JSI could be an outcome for. Stuart, I think the beauty and also the downside of bilaterals is that the benefits of the agreement are accorded to all WTO members. Typically, you just need a critical mass of economies which are happy that their main trading partners make similar or commensurate level of commitments so that they are getting something in return for giving something. The downside is that there are perennial free riders. Businesses in some jurisdiction may see maintaining domestic trade barriers in the form of tariffs, NDBs, or domestic regulations would help them, incumbents in their own backyard with years or decades of experience in the market, knowing how to navigate unwritten rules, what unstated requirements there are, and which back channels to communicate through. But I don't think this is the case for Singapore businesses, which are used to operating in a very small and very open economy with a very huge presence of multinational companies and conglomerates. So for Singapore businesses, which are used to competition, what we really want is to be able to compete on a level playing field globally. To that, Singapore is also ranked second in Asia for ease of doing business. So I would surmise that there are relatively few barriers for Singapore to sign up to the JSI, relatively few challenges. I'm mindful that the JSI would have an impact on a number of regulators in each economy. Some of them could be concerned about the loss of policy flexibility. So it may be a bit of time and effort convincing each regulator to undertake these commitments. As with any legally binding international agreement, in this case, what is needed really is a demonstration that the business need or benefit is far greater than retaining any policy flexibility, which may not even be needed in the first place. So in short, Stuart, I think we are hopeful for conclusion of the GSI at MC12. We would support the Singapore government positively considering joining the GSI so as to shape it in a manner in the interest of Singapore businesses getting a level playing field globally, if that is still possible. But mentioned earlier, we would also be more interested in seeing our major trading partners come on board together. The size of Singapore's market alone would not make a huge difference, but the size of the ASEAN services market is sizable, worth between 300 to 400 billion US dollars annually in terms of both import and export of services. So I think that's definitely something worth pursuing. And I think ASEAN should be engaged as a whole. The 26-year-old ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services was formalized into an ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement just October last year. And since then, Singapore has ratified it. So I think there's definite momentum in ASEAN, and particularly in this current economic climate in which we realize that businesses cannot rely on their domestic market alone or just one or two external markets. I think that there can be a strong case made to ASEAN governments that the potential of the ASEAN market is best tapped through stronger connections with the entire global market. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks a lot, Jason. And yeah, it was a slightly tricky question, and I thought you dealt with it expertly. And great to hear that perspective about the importance of of a level playing field, as you put it, and the important contribution that the region can make. Excellent. Now I would like to ask Jane Drake-Brockman. Jane, what's in this for Australian services providers, and why has the Australian Services Roundtable been such a long-standing advocate for GATS negotiations on domestic regulation?
Thank you, Stuart. Well, look, I've got 3 minutes, and so I'll make 3 quick points. But for us in the Australian Services Roundtable, we really believe that good trade policy always starts at home. And this agenda is what we call the cutting through the red tape agenda. And as we see it, it's actually about getting our own domestic regulatory house in order. If our regulatory regimes at home here in Australia are inefficient, our business compliance costs will be too high. We will not be competitive. We won't attract investment partners. We won't find offshore B2B niches. If our regulatory regimes are efficient, then sure, foreign firms will be happier and they will be more likely to enter our markets. But, you know, we will be equally happy. And the happiest of all will be our SMEs and micro SMEs, who will really experience the cost reductions and the productivity gains, which then allow that local boom in SME growth and SME services internationalization. So as we see it, this kind of trade reform is a real win-win all around. I mean, as I see it, it's why so many business associations can participate today and share pretty similar perspectives, really. It's why the Global Services Coalition manages to exist. It's why the Asia Pacific Services Coalition came together. It's because we're all in the same boat. Cutting trade costs is a win-win for business everywhere. And look, at my second point is just 2 weeks ago in Australia, our Minister for Trade launched Australia's first ever strategic national plan for services exports. Now, business put forward as many as 72 recommendations into that process. They fell into a number of categories, but one of them was a very crystal clear message to our government to address domestic regulatory complexity. 25 of those recommendations fell into that category. I think the government was a bit taken by surprise, but the simple fact is that if we want to even think about anything offshore, we have to make sure we aren't strangled by red tape at home before we even get a chance. We have to be competitive. And you know, if we aren't, our own local goods producers won't buy their services inputs from us either. They'll look for them offshore. No one is going to buy business services inputs that are more expensive than they need to be. You know, we are relatively geographically remote. That remoteness sometimes imposes up to a 20 to 20% cost differential for us to reach offshore markets. So unnecessarily high domestic regulatory compliance costs are literally make or break for our export performance, and that's true of all services sectors. Well, my third point is, and Stuart, have I got another minute? Can I continue? Oh, well, I'll go ahead until you stop me. But I want to say there's actually some economic theory around what I've been saying. And there is quite a strong emerging empirical base. So first of all, on the economic theory here, trade barriers tend to fall into 2 types, those that raise rents and those that raise costs. And there are relatively higher welfare gains right across the economy, including for consumers, from liberalising the barriers that are cost escalating. In goods trade, the barriers tend to be rent creating, and in services, there are many more barriers that are cost escalating. Now, a lot of modeling work has been done around this. It started back in 2009 with some groundbreaking work at Sciences Po in Paris, where they showed that trade costs for services are twice as high as they are for goods. And the modeling results that's been emerging around the world is pretty much all telling the same story. And it says that the main feature, the main outcome of services trade liberalization is a rise in the level of your own domestic production of services. That is the way in which we benefit from doing something that's good for ourselves. Now, what's the story for Asia Pacific? For decades, we've had a lot of anecdotal business evidence about the regulatory fog out there in the marketplace. But we finally begin to have some hard data. Roy has mentioned the OECD SDRI data set. 14 APEC economies are now included, and we have a brand new pilot APEC index, which includes measures of regulatory transparency. And just to pick up a point here that has come up with the investment discussion, this affects all services industries and all modes of supply. So what does the data tell us? There's a little bit of good news. As a group, APEC economies perform better than average on regulatory transparency, better than global average. But nevertheless, the preliminary OECD estimates show that if all APEC economies adopted the outcome that seems to be emerging from the JI on services DomReg, trade costs in the APEC region would drop by an average of 8% across all services sectors. And many of the sectors that would have the biggest gains are those that are relevant for e-commerce. Telecommunications, for example, would see trade costs fall 14%, computer services, financial services, courier services, logistics and transport. So my conclusion is, for the business community, this is a no-brainer. An 8% cut in trade costs would make all the difference for SME survival and post-COVID recovery in all of our economies. And as so many of us have said, the services sector is the SME sector. So I thought that Marcus Giolito was right in his opinion piece this week to say that adopting these principles is the obvious thing to do. And I really think after a year like 2020, it's also the obviously right time to do it. I'll leave it there, Stuart.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jane. That's quite a finding coming out of the OECD, isn't it? That trade costs would be reduced by 8% on average if if all APEC economies adopted the disciplines. Quite something. Thanks. Moving on then to Eduardo Pedrosa. Hi, Eduardo. Good to see you there. Now, Eduardo, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council has been a long-time champion of APEC work on trade and services and a big advocate for work specifically on domestic regulation, and largely pushed along by PEC and also ABAC. APEC did actually agree on non-binding principles as early as 2018. Can you explain a little, please, about why PEC gives this matter such priority? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that question and for the introduction. I'm very tempted to just say, for all of the reasons that Jane just outlined, it would make my life so much easier. But I actually want to engage in a little bit of nostalgia in almost in the way that Pascal Kernet did at the very beginning. As you said, Stuart, we've been working on these issues for really a very long time, but this particular story really begins around 2010. I think 10 years ago. PEC had just finished its work on a post-global financial crisis strategy for the Asia-Pacific region, and really services were identified as being critical to this strategy. They were seen as key to making growth more balanced, inclusive, and sustainable. And at exactly the same time, APEC was sort of at a milestone in its own work on the Bogle goals. So we were thinking at the same time of a post-2010 trade agenda for the region. And services were again key in that. And I think pushed along in Jane's own way, she put services front and center in that agenda as well. The evidence showed that the potential gains from services reforms far outweighed the benefits that we would have from the removal of tariffs. But moreover, and perhaps more importantly, there was an evidence base that was growing that services were absolutely critical for the competitiveness of everything else, not just services themselves, but for our own manufacturing and for agriculture, especially for developing countries. That's the kind of evidence that Jane just spoke to, but we were faced with some major problems. The services sector, while they dominate the modern economy, they're still largely seen as, in that way we used to call them, the invisibles. You know, people still, I don't we hear that term anymore, but it's still seen as the invisibles. The potential for services to contribute to economic growth and development still has to be realized due to a lack of transparency around the regulation of services, trade, and investment. Now we're getting there with initiatives like the OECD, STRI, and getting more and more APEC members on board with that. But the potential gains that could arise from the removal of these barriers and facilitating services trade were being examined by academics and researchers, but these weren't always appreciated by the policy community. So we were really being pushed along by people like Jane. I'd be remiss not to really acknowledge her and others like Gloria Pasadilla, who at that time was at the ADB Institute, and Sherry Stevenson. So we convened a conference, interestingly, Stuart, in Hong Kong on services trade, new approaches for the 21st century. And our goal really was to gather the evidence base that existed to make the case to the policy community. So we brought together everyone that we could find that was working on services. So people from ASEAN, APEC, ESCAP, the ADB, the WTO, OECD, and the services coalitions that were working on this. And one of the proposals that came out of that conference was that governments should develop a set of regulatory principles for the services sector. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're here today to discuss this. But I wanted to underscore 2 points from a survey that we did in 2016. So out of a list of 14 restrictions to services trade, ranging from regulatory transparency to foreign equity limits, it was a lack of transparency that topped the list. 63% of business respondents rated transparency as a serious to very serious impediment, compared to 54% of government respondents. So to me, this really underscores the need for public-private dialogue. I can't count the number of PPDs that we've organized along with our colleagues at ABAC and the Asia Pacific Services Coalition as part of the work that we've been doing in the APEC process for the work on services. So out of this has come the APEC Services Competitiveness Framework in 2015, and then the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, which included developing the set of good practice principles on DomReg that you mentioned, Stuart. But we're really at an important phase in this work with the midterm review of the services work in APEC. And I think it's critical not to lose momentum on this work. But once again, we're coming out of an economic crisis. The World Bank, I think, estimates that the regional growth could be 1% slower over the next decade unless we implement important reforms that will improve productivity for regional economies. And what kind of reforms are we talking about? It's exactly those types of reforms that Devi spoke to, that Jane spoke to, that will unleash the potential of our businesses, the small businesses, to get productive and to create jobs for our people. So I've gone over time. I apologize, Stuart, but that's my main message for you. Thanks a lot, Stuart.
Eduardo, that's great. Thank you so much, and very, very interesting to hear about your survey and the different perceptions between government and business, and and the need for more dialogue. That's a really interesting point, I think. I'll just note that there's a couple of really simple questions coming in. One is the WTO still relevant? Question mark. And how will the text of the JSI on domestic regulation address the concerns raised by India and South Africa? So I'll just note those. Jaime, these may be coming your way later if we still have time. But I think for the immediate sequence, we need to move on to our remaining two discussants. And first of all, let me turn to Patrick Chua. Patrick, in many ways, the principles emerging from this joint initiative look very similar to APEC's non-binding principles on domestic regulation of services sectors. These latter non-binding principles were developed under APEC's services competitiveness framework, initiated under the Philippines chairmanship in 2015, and reflecting the growing importance of services in your economy. I gather that BPO, for example, has grown even during 2020, which is quite a feat. Last year, APEC, that's the APEC, ABAC, I should say, sorry, that's the APEC Business Advisory Council, urged APEC leaders to ensure that all APEC economies participated in the WTO negotiations, but they aren't all on board yet. What does the services business community think about this from your perspective in Manila? Over to you, Patrick.
Hi, Stewart. Thank you for the question. And yeah, it's such a pleasure hearing from the speakers before me. And I think you will also hear me echoing some of the points. But just to go over briefly, as you pointed out, yes, as any other economy, the services sector is a key growth driver, especially for the Philippines. As you pointed out, services, including structural reform, was a high priority during our APEC chairmanship in 2015. And now we're halfway through the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap. The digital revolution, the challenge of inclusion and sustainability, and now with the pandemic, we are urgently called to enhance services competitiveness by addressing barriers to services trade and investments, and basically strengthening our services industries. But how to do that? You made mention about our BPOs. The BPO sector in the Philippines is backed by a very proactive industry association, the IT and Business Process Association of the Philippines, that works with stakeholders on the necessary interventions. But just like any sector adversely impacted by the pandemic, among other factors, including automation and protectionist policies, the industry association has reduced its target, its original revenue target of about $39 billion and employment goals of 1.8 million direct employees by 2022. But even achieving a lower target hinges on several factors. Perhaps the most critical, as it also affects other sectors, is building the digital infrastructure. With strategic inputs from the private sector, the government will have to set the enabling environment. So what has been done so far? In the Philippines, just to cite two examples, in 2018, we passed the Ease of Doing Business and Efficient Government Service Delivery Act. It aims to further streamline the systems and processes in government services. Just last year, as an offshoot of the related issuances, in just about 5 months, over 2,200 construction permits have been approved in what previously took 8 to 9 months for just a handful of the applications. So domestically, there's this clamor, and perhaps little by little, the need is growing. So together with service improvements due to competition, the average fixed and mobile broadband speeds clocked significant improvements in the Philippines. So other relevant policy and regulatory reforms we enacted includes the measures of allowing 100% total equity for foreign banks and removing practice of profession requirements and reducing the mandatory number of direct local employees so for foreign investment. So though the Philippines, you may note that it's not yet part of the negotiations, the need is growing and it's becoming more evident as services sector and industries plays a crucial role in the pandemic recovery and moving forward. So perhaps the most change and impact we have seen in the services sector, and you may see this soon with Jane's work on ABAC's contribution to the review of the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, particularly for the Philippines, is actually in financial services with the rise of e-wallets and virtual banks at the palm of our hands. Financial inclusion has been revolutionary for the Philippines, over 100 million people in over thousands of islands. So then again, with that, it is very critical to build and strengthen digital infrastructure to support this innovation. And I'll go back again that to underscore the role of public-private partnership and engagement in this process, as also Eduardo has rightfully pointed out. And with that, I joined the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, the respective services coalitions and industries to reach out to our government counterparts, including myself, know the issues, provide the inputs and support so we can better engage. Let us get the key stakeholders, of course, us included, to discuss and work on viable solutions so we can harness services competitiveness, most especially in this pandemic scenario. So just to echo and reiterate, public-private partnership and engagement is key. We need to sit down and talk and work on viable solutions. So again, on our coalition, we'll be preparing hopefully additional inputs to push. Eduardo said we've run a number of public-private dialogues, so we should not be wary and grow tired of it. We've gone a long way, and please expect that we will do more, and together with ABAC and other stakeholders in the region and beyond, we will not grow tired of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. That's excellent, an excellent contribution. And now I'll turn to our last discussant, but one of the most important, Marcus Giolito, who is, of course, from the WTO Secretariat. And Marcus, the WTO Secretariat has undertaken some work on the potential economic benefits of an agreement on domestic regulation. And I'm hoping you might be able to share some of the insights from that work. Over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, indeed. Maybe just to start, obviously, as Jane and other speakers have pointed out, there is a lot of literature and evidence already that links services, trade policies more general with economic performance. In the WTO Secretariat, the situation that presented itself to us was that once members had agreed essentially on all the disciplines, so we had actual text of disciplines in a very stable format, we had numerous delegations who approached the Secretariat essentially with two questions. One, can we participate in this? Is our regulation compatible with these disciplines? or would we be liable to being in violation? And secondly, do these concrete disciplines actually convey and confer any economic benefits to us? So that was the angle that we took. So we were looking not at governance provisions, trade restrictions and services generally, but we were able to zoom in on the precise text of the disciplines and try to locate them in domestic applied regimes, in members' domestic regulatory regime, as well as in the RTAs that many members have undertaken, particularly since 2005. So our angle is one that is a bit more precise and focused on the disciplines per se. So our findings will be forthcoming in a research paper very soon, but I wanted to highlight a number of smaller points here that came out of our research. First, there was a very clear correlation that economies that are ready to implement more disciplines in their domestic regulatory frameworks tend to participate more actively in international services trade. And I think this finding confirms the common belief, probably held by most of you who are with us here today, that a more transparent and predictable regulatory environment promotes trade, and that cutting red tape and streamlining procedures and requirements is key to improving opportunities for service suppliers to participate in such trade. We also found that in economies with more domestic regulation disciplines in place, the level of domestic entrepreneurship tends to be greater. And entrepreneurship obviously is essential for the development of markets as it promotes innovation and competition. And it can also particularly benefit small businesses and women entrepreneurs who are typically less well equipped to navigate opaque and costly requirements and procedures. Our analysis also covered effects in individual services sectors. For example, we looked at the telecommunications sector and found that economies that implement more disciplines at the national level tend to have lower prices and more competition in the mobile telecommunications sector. Again, we suspect that faster, clearer, and less costly authorization procedures would have a positive impact and drive down consumer prices in these sectors. As I said, we have a paper that is ready to go almost and will be released probably in the next month. But what this research points to is a point that I think was also raised by Pascal and Jane before, that the benefits of adopting the disciplines, they're largely reaped domestically. There are positive effects for your exporting service suppliers, yes, but I think the signaling effect that adoption of these disciplines can have in terms of your own domestic business climate, the signaling effect to investors, that is something that is not to be underestimated. And that's why I personally believe that many economies participating in the SDR negotiations are not particularly obsessed with the critical mass aspect of this. These are not concessions traded like tariffs in the same way. I think these good governance provisions, I think they contribute to domestic reforms and efforts to lower or increase the ranking and doing business that countries are very kind of keen on to do, or compliance with the OECD restrictiveness indicators. So I think this is a little bit the motivation of our participants. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Yeah, I think that last point is really important. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to really thank and congratulate all of the discussants for getting through a huge amount of work and a lot of subjects in remarkably short time. Well done, and thanks to you all. I feel that before we wrap up, we ought to go back to Jaime and give him a chance to give us any comments in the light of what he's heard. There are 2 or 3 questions out there which have come in on the Q&A. I don't know, Jaime, it's asking a bit much to ask you to deal with these in your final remarks, but if you can touch on some of them, that would be much appreciated. We have one small question there, which is the WTO still relevant? And it's actually related, I think, to another question which came in a little bit later from Gabriel Gary, who asks, to what extent will undertaking commitments on disciplines on domestic regulation actually trigger domestic reforms? Or is it rather that the countries commit at the international level what already exists at the domestic level without the need to introduce reforms? Those 2 questions are kind of linked, I think. And then the other question was, how will the text on domestic regulation address the concerns raised by India and South Africa? And how does India not joining the JSI impact its outcome, considering the role that the joint initiative is playing in supporting services sectors and India's position in that? So, Jaime, it's asking you a bit much, but could you, in 3 or 4 minutes, respond to the extent that you're able? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stuart, and I would like to take this opportunity also to thank to all the speakers today's event. So it has been very rich discussion. So thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts and experiences. There was a discussion on the relevance of the WTO. I think, I come from Costa Rica, a country that can say yes, it's still relevant, and we as a small country, we are confident that it keeps relevant. So this initiative actually tries to contribute actually to keep the WTO as relevant as possible. And it's as relevant as we are now discussing at the WTO as part of the COVID crisis and solution, and a way out of this issue on the vaccines that you have heard about that. So because WTO is part of the solution, as is part of the solution in this case. So of course, WTO is still relevant. The fact that in the past few years we haven't been able to agree or to move towards finalization of the negotiation, it doesn't mean that it's not relevant. We have a solid organization and a solid multilateral trading system, and we have to take care of it. So that's why we are interested in these initiatives that try to keep the WTO relevant and response to the actual to the real world and to the real challenges of the world. Regarding the other related question, which is the application of how these the disciplines negotiated will entail reform of national reform. I think it will depend very much on the regulatory framework of each of the participating members. Some of them they have indicated that they can comply from the very first day. Some others, and we are actually in an information exchange exercise quite interesting in the group, showing cases in which some countries, some members, some participating members are using this as an opportunity actually to update their regulatory frameworks, to indicate the way to proceed and to cut red tape in all these bureaucracy and bureaucratic procedures regarding licenses and other types of issues. So it will depend very much. I would like to say that the disciplines do not impose any kind of regulation on the substance. There's a set of principles set of good governance principles, I should say, for the participating members, to which the participating members commit. Regarding the last question that comes from an anonymous participant, I would like to say that, well, first of all, why India is not participating here? I think this is a question to the government of India. I cannot answer on behalf of the government of India. I think this is a question that may be raised by the services sector, which we know, we all know that is very important in India. It's a question that the services sector should ask to the government of India. But let me tell you what the other questions on the concerns that India and South Africa have expressed. I think we have tried to keep a dialogue with India and South Africa on these issues. Actually, at today's General Council, there was the discussion on this issue. We have to answer. We have answered those questions. I mean, in a very plain manner, and I think quite simple way. We believe that our disciplines are soundly based, have a sound legal base in the WTO, including the WTO agreements. The outcome that is ambitious will be incorporated, as you know, into our GATT schedules of specific commitments. In substance, it covers precisely those types of measures that are listed in the GATT as areas for additional commitments, namely qualifications, standard, and licensing matter. And then we will give legal effect to the outcome by describing the disciplines as additional commitments in our respective GATT schedule, which is something that we are applying well-established multilateral WTO procedures. I can elaborate further, but I'm afraid we don't have enough time. But happy to continue this dialogue as well on the technical issues regarding this question. So thank you very much for this opportunity again.
Well, thank you, Jaime, once more. And I think, unfortunately, although we have so many things we could discuss, but I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. I mean, just on Jaime's contribution and his remarks on the WTO relevance and all that, for people maybe who are not in the Geneva area, you know, we need to pay tribute to people like Jaime and the delegation of Costa Rica. They're making a massive contribution to the trading system. I mean, not only is Jaime chairing the initiative on services domestic regulation, but his ambassador is chairing the negotiations on agriculture. And one of their former trade ministers from Costa Rica has just been appointed as a deputy director general. I mean, this is a huge contribution, and we owe the country a great debt of gratitude, or at least those of us who support the multilateral trading system do. So I just wanted to say that, Jaime, before we wrap up. Also, very sincere thanks to Pascal, to Kirtaka, Roy, Lee, Devi, Jason, Jane, Eduardo, Patrick, and Marcus. I think you made fantastic contributions, and it was all very complimentary. You know, it's impossible to sum up such a wide-ranging discussion, but, you know, there was a lot of talk about the need to improve competitiveness and reducing costs, and this is a key initiative in that respect. There were interesting comments about the need for more public-private dialogue and participation as being a key factor. A lot of comments about need to improve transparency and predictability in regulation. And Marcus's final point that, you know, we're not talking about concessions like tariffs here. This is, as Jane said, this is a win-win deal. So this is a different animal from the usual mercantilist approach that we sometimes see in trade negotiations. So I think I have to stop there because we're over time. But just before signing off, let me express great appreciation to our 4 co-hosts for organising what I think was an extremely informative and useful session. And in particular, I'd like to mention the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide, especially Jane Drake-Brockman as the perhaps the prime mover in this session, and also to Lydia Joshing for her heroic work on the logistical side as well. Thanks very much, Lydia. Well done. And I wish you all a very good evening, morning, afternoon, whatever's coming up, and look forward to seeing you again on some future occasion. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.